Good evening, my friends, and welcome to Edward's Sleep Mysteries. I'm Edward, here to keep you company as the day comes to a close. Before our story begins, I wonder, is there one small thing you like to do before sleep? Perhaps dimming the lights, settling into a favourite chair, or simply listening quietly? You may share it with us if you wish. Subscribe if these moments bring you comfort. Now breathe slowly and allow the story to carry you gently onward. Chapter 1. The Morning That Arrived Uninvited. There are mornings which arrive upon the world with the gentle punctuality of a familiar friend, bringing with them no more surprise than the turning of a well-worn page or the striking of a clock whose chime has been heard, unchanged for generations. Such mornings ask nothing of us save that we rise, dress, and proceed through our accustomed rounds with a comfortable certainty that all shall unfold precisely as it has unfolded before. The sun, should it choose to appear at all through the grey English winter sky, does so with a kind of apologetic modesty, as though aware that its presence is expected but not particularly required. Christmas morning in the small town of Hallowmere had long been precisely such a morning. Hallowmere itself, being a settlement of some 300 souls nestled in a fold of the Cotswold Hills, possessed all the virtues of English provincial life and very few of its vices. Its high street boasted a respectable grocer, a draper of long standing, a public house whose sign had swung above the same doorway since the time of good Queen Anne, and a lending library presided over by Miss Thornbury, whose opinions on modern literature were as fixed and immovable as the very stones of which her establishment was built. The church, dedicated to St. Edmund the Martyr, occupied the highest ground in the town, its square tower visible from every lane and cottage, a perpetual reminder of obligations both spiritual and temporal. On this particular Christmas morning, the 25th of December in the year of our Lord 1873, the town presented its usual aspect of frost-touched tranquillity. The rooftops wore their seasonal mantles of white with becoming grace. The church bells, under the measured direction of Mr. Hobbs the verger, rang out their familiar summons with neither excessive enthusiasm nor regrettable languor. Smoke rose from chimneys in orderly columns, suggesting fires well tended and households awakening to the day's gentle demands. Yet there was, upon this morning, a certain quality in the air which the more observant among Hallowmere's inhabitants might have detected, had they been inclined toward such detection. It was nothing so dramatic as a storm cloud, nothing so obvious as an unexpected visitor standing at the town's edge. It was rather the sort of disturbance one might feel before a long-settled question is suddenly asked anew, or a door long closed is found to be not quite so firmly latched as had been supposed. Mrs. Eleanor Finch, widow, resided in a modest cottage on Chapel Lane, distinguished from its neighbours chiefly by the exceptional neatness of its front garden and the unfailing cleanliness of its windows. She was a woman of perhaps 55 years, possessed of that particular English composure which mistakes neither coldness for dignity nor sentiment for weakness. Her husband, the late Mr. Thomas Finch, had been a clerk of probity, if not prosperity, and had left her, upon his death some 12 years previous, a small competence sufficient for comfort, but inadequate for display. It was well known in Hallowmere that Mrs. Finch's habits were charitable without being ostentatious. She visited the sick with regularity, contributed to the poor box with quiet consistency, and could be relied upon to organise the church fete with admirable efficiency and minimal dramatics. She was, in short, precisely the sort of person whom a community values deeply, while scarcely noticing at all, her goodness being of that unobtrusive variety which functions best when least remarked upon. On this Christmas morning, Mrs. Finch had risen at her customary hour, attended to her small household duties, and was engaged in arranging her parlour for the modest festivities of the day, when she heard the decisive knock of the postal messenger upon her door. This in itself was unremarkable, Christmas being a season when even the most retiring individuals might expect some communication from distant relations or old acquaintances. What was remarkable, though Mrs. Finch gave no outward sign of finding it so, was the nature of the letter which the messenger placed into her hands. The envelope was of heavy cream-coloured stock, sealed with red wax impressed with a mark Mrs. Finch did not immediately recognise. The direction was written in a clerk's careful copperplate, and bore the return address of Messrs. Caldwell and Sons, solicitors, of Lincoln's Inn Fields, London. It had the weight and formality of a communication concerning matters of business rather than sentiment, and Mrs. Finch received it with the same calm countenance with which she received all things, neither hastening to open it nor setting it carelessly aside. The postal messenger, a young man named Dobbs who had held his position for less than a 12-month and still laboured under the impression that his observations were of interest to others, attempted to engage Mrs. Finch in speculation regarding the letter's contents. Mrs. Finch thanked him with perfect courtesy, wished him the compliments of the season, and gently but firmly closed her door. She stood for a moment in her narrow hallway, the letter in her hands, and those who knew her well, had any been present to observe, might have noticed the slightest alteration in her expression. It was not alarm, nor even surprise, but rather the look of one who has long anticipated a particular piece of news, and finds, upon its arrival, that anticipation has not diminished its significance. Without haste, but with evident purpose, Mrs. Finch carried the letter to her small writing desk, placed it carefully among her other correspondence, and proceeded with her preparations for the day. She dressed for church in her customary dark wool, arranged her bonnet with its modest trimming of ribbon, and departed her cottage at precisely the hour which would allow her to arrive at St. Edmund's, neither conspicuously early nor regrettably late. The letter remained upon the desk unopened, its seal unbroken, its contents undisclosed. Yet its presence had altered something in the very atmosphere of the cottage, much as a single cloud, though small and distant, may alter the quality of light across an entire landscape. Mrs. Finch had received it with restraint because she was a woman of restraint, but she had also received it as one receives that which has been, in some quiet corner of the heart, long expected. The town of Hallowmere, occupied with its Christmas devotions and domestic pleasures, noticed nothing amiss. The day proceeded with its accustomed gentleness. Yet something long settled had been, however quietly, stirred, and though the ripples were not yet visible upon the surface, they were already spreading outward through waters whose stillness had been, perhaps, more apparent than real. Chapter 2, A Letter Set Aside with Care. The observance of Christmas Day in Hallowmere followed a pattern as reliable as the phases of the moon, and considerably more agreeable to those who find comfort in the predictable succession of modest pleasures. The morning service at St. Edmund's drew all but the most determinedly irreligious or the positively bedridden, and even among these latter several made heroic efforts to attend, supported by the arms of devoted relations and the certainty that absence would be noted and discussed. Mrs. Finch took her accustomed place in the third pew from the front on the left-hand side as one faces the altar, a location which she had occupied with such consistency over the years that the very wood seemed to have accommodated itself to her particular form. She sat with her hymnal open upon her lap, her gloved hands folded atop it, her expression composed in that attitude of respectful attention which suggests a mind both present to its devotions and undistracted by worldly concerns. The Reverend Matthew Crowley, a gentleman of perhaps 40 years whose scholarly inclinations had been somewhat dampened by the practical demands of a country parish, delivered a sermon of irreproachable sentiment and comfortable length. He spoke of the Nativity, as was proper to the season, and of the virtues of charity, humility, and neighbourly affection, themes which could offend no one, and which had the advantage of requiring neither excessive preparation nor dangerous originality. His voice, though lacking the commanding resonance of some of his more theatrical brethren in the cloth, possessed a gentle earnestness which suited both his nature and the temperament of his flock. As the congregation rose and settled, sang and prayed, Mrs. Finch participated with her usual quiet diligence. Yet had any soul been watching her with particular care, which none were, they might have observed that her gaze occasionally drifted to the stained glass window depicting the flight into Egypt, and that when it did so a certain pensiveness crossed her features, as fleeting as shadow upon water. Among the congregation that morning were personages whose acquaintance the reader would do well to make, for they shall prove material to our narrative. Mr. Jonathan Hale occupied a pew some 3 rows behind Mrs. Finch, positioned where he might observe, without obvious scrutiny, the assembled worthies of the town. He was a bachelor of independent means, neither young nor precisely old, being somewhere in that indefinite territory where a man might be anywhere between 35 and 50, depending upon the light and his most recent dinner. He had come to Hallowmere some 7 years previous, seeking, as he explained to those who inquired, a quiet place in which to pursue his literary and historical interests. These interests manifested themselves chiefly in the form of detailed journals regarding the daily life of the town, observations which he recorded with the meticulous attention of one who believes that the small truths of ordinary existence contain more genuine value than the celebrated dramas of distant capitals. Mr. Hale was blessed, or perhaps cursed, with the particular quality of noticing things. Not in the manner of those who notice only what serves their vanity or confirms their prejudices, but with a genuine curiosity about the patterns and peculiarities of human behaviour. He noticed, for instance, that Mrs. Lowen's hat this Christmas morning bore a new silk ribbon of deep burgundy, suggesting either improved circumstances or a willingness to exceed them. He noticed that young Dobbs, the postal messenger, seated in the back beside his mother, appeared unusually alert, as though possessed of information he considered consequential. Most particularly, he noticed that Mrs. Finch, though maintaining her customary outward demeanour, held herself with a certain quality of restraint that went beyond mere composure. It was the attitude of one consciously governing strong feeling, rather than one experiencing no feeling at all. Mr. Hale, whose profession it was to observe such distinctions, made a small mental notation of this fact, filed it away among his other observations, and returned his attention to the Reverend's sermon. Mrs. Beatrice Lowen, widow of the late Mr. Charles Lowen, who had been something significant in the grain trade, sat in the front pew with the assurance of one whose position in local society was both established and vigilantly maintained. She was a woman of considerable presence, not solely on account of her physical dimensions, which were generous, but more particularly because of her unwavering conviction that the proper ordering of society depended upon persons of discernment, paying close attention to matters which lesser individuals might foolishly ignore. These matters included, though were by no means limited to, questions of inheritance, property, marriage, and the various subtle gradations of social precedence, which distinguish a truly civilized community from mere aggregations of humanity. Mrs. Lowen had observed the arrival of the postal messenger at Mrs. Finch's cottage that morning, having been fortuitously positioned at her parlour window at the relevant moment. She had noted the quality of the envelope, the London postmark, and the solicitor's return direction. She had further noted that Mrs. Finch, upon receiving this communication, had closed her door with what might, to a less perceptive observer, have appeared to be ordinary courtesy, but which Mrs. Lowen interpreted as significant discretion. All of this information had been carefully stored away for future consideration, and, should occasion warrant judicious deployment in conversation, the service concluded with a final hymn, rendered with more enthusiasm than precision, and the congregation dispersed into the pale winter sunlight with expressions of seasonal goodwill and invitations to modest refreshment. Mrs. Finch exchanged courteous words with several neighbours, accepted with gracious humility the thanks of those who had benefited from her charitable attentions during the preceding year, and made her way homeward along streets where ice still glittered in the shadows untouched by the sun's weak warmth. The afternoon passed in that pleasant suspension of ordinary activity which characterises Christmas Day in respectable households. Mrs. Finch partook of a simple dinner, read for a time from her well-worn Book of Common Prayer, and attended to certain small domestic arrangements which required neither haste nor delay. The letter from Messrs. Caldwell and Sons remained upon her writing desk, its presence neither forgotten nor urgently attended to, much like a difficult conversation one knows must occur, but which need not occur immediately. As the early winter darkness began to settle upon Hallowmere, and lamps were lit in windows throughout the town, Mrs. Finch at last took up the letter and examined it more closely. The seal bore the impress of the firm, 3 interlocked letters beneath a representation of scales, that ancient symbol of legal judgment and measured deliberation. She turned the envelope over in her hands, feeling its weight, noting the precision of the direction, postponing by these small attentions the moment of actual revelation. Then, with the decisive gesture of one who has concluded that postponement serves no useful purpose, she broke the seal and withdrew the contents. There were several pages, written in the clear hand of a professional clerk and headed with formal precision, in the matter of the estate of Miss Arabella Wainwright, deceased. Mrs. Finch read slowly, her expression unchanging, though once or twice she paused to reread a particular passage, as though confirming what she had already understood. The letter informed her, in language whose legal formality scarcely disguised its essential human significance, that certain property and funds long held in a complicated arrangement of trusts and disputed claims had at last been resolved by the courts. Through various instruments and provisions whose details need not concern us, these assets had been determined to belong, rightfully and legally, to Mrs. Eleanor Finch, née Ashford, of Hallowmere. The sum was not vast by the standards of the wealthy, but it was considerable by any measure relevant to Mrs. Finch's circumstances. The property consisted of a small estate in Somerset, together with its rents and revenues dating back some 23 years to the death of the aforementioned Miss Wainwright. Messrs. Caldwell and Sons awaited Mrs. Finch's instructions regarding the management and disposition of these newly restored assets, and remained, with expressions of professional regard, her obedient servants. Mrs. Finch folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. She sat for some time in the gathering darkness, the lamp on her desk casting a circle of warm light that seemed to emphasize rather than dispel the shadows of the room. Her hands, still gloved, rested quietly in her lap. Her face, illuminated by the lamplight, bore an expression of such complex feeling that no simple word could adequately describe it. There was sadness there, certainly, and perhaps a species of relief. There was remembrance of things long past and recognition of consequences long delayed. But there was neither triumph nor resentment, neither satisfaction nor regret of the common sort. At length she rose, extinguished the lamp, and retired to her chamber. The letter remained upon the desk, its contents known only to herself. The town of Hallowmere slept peacefully, unaware that the comfortable surface of its collective memory had been disturbed, and that questions long buried beneath the sediment of years might soon require answering. The peace of Christmas night settled upon the town like snow, soft and silent, and covering all things equally. But beneath that peace something had shifted, and though none yet knew it, the morning would bring changes as subtle and as irreversible as the turning of the season. Chapter 3, Faces That Knew the Season Too Well. The days which follow Christmas possess a peculiar quality, being neither quite festive nor entirely ordinary, suspended as they are in that interval between celebration and the resumption of normal affairs. In Hallowmere, this intermediate period was marked by the continuation of neighbourly visits, the consumption of remaining seasonal delicacies, and a general reluctance to abandon completely the gentler rhythms of holiday observance for the more demanding tempo of everyday industry. It was during these days, unremarkable in themselves, that certain subtle alterations in the town's atmosphere began to manifest, perceptible only to those possessed of particular sensitivity to the currents of human interaction. These changes were not dramatic. No voices were raised in the street, no accusations flung across garden walls. Indeed, to the casual observer, Hallowmere presented its usual aspect of provincial tranquillity. Yet something had shifted, as surely as a river's current shifts when a stone, though unseen beneath the surface, alters the water's flow. Mr. Jonathan Hale, whose habits included a daily constitutional through the town's principal thoroughfares regardless of weather, noticed these alterations with the practised attention of one who has made human behaviour his particular study. On the morning of the 27th of December, encountering Mrs. Finch near the lending library, he observed that Mrs. Pemberton, the baker's wife, offered her greeting with a certain studied quality, as though the ordinary words of daily courtesy required unusual consideration before utterance. The greeting itself was perfectly civil, even warm, yet it possessed that indefinable character of calculation which distinguishes the carefully prepared from the genuinely spontaneous. Later that same day, taking his luncheon at the public house, Mr. Hale noted that conversation at the adjoining table ceased abruptly when Mrs. Finch passed the window outside, resuming only after she had moved beyond earshot. The silence itself was unremarkable, being of the sort that often accompanies the passage of any respected personage. What arrested Mr. Hale's attention was the quality of the glances exchanged among the temporarily silent parties, glances which suggested not merely notice, but speculation of a purposeful variety. These observations, individually insignificant, accumulated in Mr. Hale's mind with the steady accretion of evidence whose meaning remains obscure yet undeniably present. He was not a man given to hasty conclusions, nor did he possess that unfortunate tendency, common among certain students of human nature, to impose dramatic interpretations upon perfectly innocent circumstances. Yet he could not escape the conviction that something in the town's relationship to Mrs. Finch had undergone a transformation, subtle but unmistakable. The source of this transformation became clearer when, on the 28th, Mr. Hale encountered Mrs. Lowen emerging from the draper's establishment. That lady, never reluctant to engage in conversation when possessed of information she deemed significant, greeted him with an expression of what might charitably be called concerned interest. "Mr. Hale," said she, arranging her parcels with the air of one performing a task of some importance, I trust you enjoyed a pleasant Christmas." Mr. Hale assured her that he had, and returned the courtesy with appropriate inquiries regarding her own festivities. "Most agreeable," Mrs. Lowen replied, though her tone suggested that pleasantness was not her primary concern at present. Though one cannot help but reflect at such seasons upon the mysteries of Providence and the unexpected turns which fortune may take. Mr. Hale, recognising the preamble to a communication of substance, waited with patient curiosity. "I observed," Mrs. Lowen continued, lowering her voice to that pitch which suggests confidentiality, while remaining perfectly audible to any interested parties, "that Mrs. Finch received a letter on Christmas morning, from a London solicitor no less, Messrs. Caldwell and Sons of Lincoln's Inn Fields." She paused, allowing the significance of this intelligence to settle upon her audience. "Indeed?" said Mr. Hale, maintaining an expression of polite interest. "Indeed," confirmed Mrs. Lowen. "One cannot help but wonder what business a person of Mrs. Finch's station might have with such a firm. They are not, I believe, the sort who concern themselves with trifling matters." Mr. Hale observed that legal communications might arise from any number of circumstances, most of them quite ordinary. Mrs. Lowen inclined her head in acknowledgment of this theoretical possibility, while her expression made clear that she considered it highly improbable in the present instance. Quite so, and yet one recalls certain matters from years past, events which were never perhaps entirely clarified to the satisfaction of those who might reasonably expect clarification. With this oracular pronouncement, and a meaningful glance which Mr. Hale found both intriguing and frustratingly opaque, Mrs. Lowen gathered her parcels and continued on her way, leaving him to ponder what she had so carefully avoided stating directly. That evening Mr. Hale recorded in his journal the observations of recent days, noting with particular care the alteration in how Mrs. Finch was regarded by her neighbours. He wrote, "There has emerged a quality of attention toward E.F. which suggests the revival of old knowledge, or perhaps the recognition that what was thought concluded may yet prove otherwise. The town watches her now with eyes that have remembered something they had, whether deliberately or through the simple passage of years, contrived to forget." The following Sunday, the first after Christmas, provided further confirmation of this curious phenomenon. At the church service, Mr. Hale noted that while Mrs. Finch occupied her usual pew, the patterns of social interaction before and after the service had subtly altered. Greetings were offered with a shade more formality, conversations concluded more swiftly when she approached, and throughout the congregation there circulated an atmosphere of heightened awareness, as though each person present was simultaneously observing and being observed. The Reverend Crowley's sermon that morning touched upon themes of forgiveness and the wisdom of leaving judgment to higher authorities, topics which might have been seasonally appropriate or might, to more suspicious minds, have carried contemporary relevance. The Reverend himself appeared somewhat distracted, his usual gentle earnestness tempered by occasional glances toward Mrs. Finch's pew, suggesting that he too was conscious of currents running beneath the surface of ordinary observance. After the service, Mr. Hale contrived to walk a portion of the way homeward with the Reverend, their conversation beginning with innocuous remarks about the weather and the satisfactory attendance at that morning's worship. Eventually, with the delicacy of one approaching a subject which may prove sensitive, Mr. Hale ventured to observe that Mrs. Finch appeared to be the object of unusual interest of late. The Reverend's response was guarded. "Mrs. Finch is a valued member of this congregation," he said carefully. "Her charitable works and steady character have long been appreciated." "Indeed," Mr. Hale agreed, "which makes the current atmosphere all the more puzzling. One senses a revival of old curiosities." The Reverend walked in silence for several paces before replying. "There are matters," he said at length, "which occurred many years ago, circumstances which were, at the time, the subject of various interpretations. I counselled several parties in confidence during that period. The details, I confess, have grown less distinct with time, as is perhaps merciful." He paused at the corner where their paths diverged, his expression troubled. "I would counsel against excessive speculation, Mr. Hale. The past is often less simple than memory makes it, and certainty is a luxury we possess less frequently than we imagine." With this somewhat cryptic farewell, the Reverend continued toward the rectory, leaving Mr. Hale to contemplate the growing mystery. It had become clear that Mrs. Finch's Christmas letter had awakened something in Hallowmere's collective memory, some history that involved not merely herself but others in the town, and which remained, even after the passage of years, imperfectly understood and incompletely resolved. The question was not whether something significant had occurred in the past, but what precisely had occurred, and why the mere receipt of a solicitor's letter should cause that past to press so insistently upon the present. Mr. Hale, his curiosity now thoroughly engaged, determined to pursue the matter further, not from any desire to expose wrongdoing, but from that fundamental impulse which drives all genuine seekers after truth, the conviction that understanding serves justice better than speculation, and that clarity, however uncomfortable, is preferable to the corrosive effects of unexamined suspicion. Chapter 4. Questions Asked Without Expectation. There exists a particular art to the asking of questions, an art which distinguishes the genuine seeker of understanding from the mere collector of gossip. The latter asks with the answer already formed, seeking only confirmation of predetermined conclusions. The former asks with genuine openness, prepared to be instructed by whatever truth may emerge, however inconvenient or surprising it may prove to preconceived notions. Mr. Jonathan Hale possessed this art to a considerable degree, having cultivated it through years of careful observation and a natural temperament inclined more toward curiosity than judgment. He understood that direct interrogation often yields less truth than gentle conversation, and that people reveal most when they believe themselves to be merely reminiscing rather than testifying. Thus, in the days following his exchange with the Reverend Crowley, he set about the delicate task of gathering information with neither haste nor obviousness. His first opportunity presented itself on the 2nd of January, when he encountered Mrs. Lowen at the grocer's establishment. That lady was engaged in a detailed examination of preserved fruits, an activity which required apparently considerable time and serious deliberation. Mr. Hale, selecting items for his own modest household, found himself positioned adjacent to her, amid the aromatic atmosphere of tea, coffee, and spices, which gave the shop its characteristic and not unpleasant scent. "Mrs. Lowen," he ventured, after allowing a suitable interval for the completion of her inspection of a jar of damson preserves, "I wonder if I might prevail upon your memory regarding a matter of local history." Mrs. Lowen, never averse to being consulted on subjects which allowed her to display her comprehensive knowledge of Hallowmere's affairs, set down the jar and turned toward him with an expression of interested attention. "I am attempting," Mr. Hale continued, "to compile a more complete chronicle of the town's recent decades. You mentioned, when we spoke previously, certain events from years past which remained imperfectly clarified. I confess the reference intrigued me, though I would not wish to trespass upon matters of a private nature." Mrs. Lowen required no further encouragement. "You refer, I collect, to the winter of 1850. A difficult season, Mr. Hale, and one which left certain questions unresolved in the minds of those who recall it." She glanced about the shop, noted that they were alone, save for young Mr. Parsons behind the counter, who was advantageously deaf in one ear, and lowered her voice to a confidential pitch. "Miss Arabella Wainwright," she began, "was a lady of independent means who resided at Wainwright House, some 2 miles beyond the town proper, a woman of perhaps 45 years at the time of which I speak, possessed of considerable property and no near relations. She employed several servants, among them a young woman named Eleanor Ashford, who served as her companion." "Ashford," Mr. Hale repeated thoughtfully. "That was Mrs. Finch's maiden name, was it not?" "It was indeed," confirmed Mrs. Lowen. "Mrs. Finch, as she now is, served Miss Wainwright for some 3 years. She was a capable young woman, well-spoken and attentive to her duties. Miss Wainwright grew greatly dependent upon her, or so it was observed by those who had occasion to visit the house." Mrs. Lowen paused, selecting her next words with visible care. "In the autumn of that year there were certain rumours. Nothing definite, you understand, but whispers concerning a child. Some said Miss Wainwright had taken in a foundling. Others suggested matters of a more delicate nature. The household became exceedingly private, receiving few visitors and conducting its affairs with unusual discretion." "And then," prompted Mr. Hale gently, "Miss Wainwright fell ill that winter. It was sudden, or seemed so to those not intimate with the household. She was attended by Dr. Morehouse, who has since passed away, and by Eleanor Ashford, who nursed her with devotion. The illness progressed swiftly, and Miss Wainwright died on the 14th of February 1851. Mrs. Lowen's expression grew more complex, combining regret, curiosity, and something approaching disapproval. The peculiarity, Mr. Hale, lay in what followed. The estate, which was considerable, passed to distant cousins in Hampshire. The child, if child there was, disappeared from Hallowmere. Some said it had died, others that it had been sent away. Eleanor Ashford left service shortly thereafter and removed to London. When she returned some years later as Mrs. Finch, widow of a respectable clerk, none thought to question her too closely. The past, it seemed, had been concluded. Yet you suggest it was not. Mrs. Lowen pursed her lips. There were always those who wondered whether Miss Wainwright's will had been properly executed, whether all parties had received their rightful portions. The lawyer who handled the estate, a Mr. Caldwell of London, conducted matters with such dispatch that certain formalities seemed, to suspicious minds, somewhat hurried. The same firm, then, that recently communicated with Mrs. Finch. The very same, Mrs. Lowen confirmed with meaningful emphasis, which suggests, does it not, that matters presumed settled may have been merely postponed. Mr. Hale thanked Mrs. Lowen for her recollections and departed the grocer's with much to consider. The outlines of a story were beginning to emerge, though its true shape remained obscure. A wealthy woman, a devoted companion, a mysterious child, and a death followed by a hasty disposition of property. It was a combination of elements which might suggest several different narratives, some innocent, others less so. That evening, Mr. Hale called upon the Reverend Crowley at the rectory, that comfortable if somewhat draughty establishment which housed Hallowmere's spiritual shepherd. The Reverend received him in his study, a room whose shelves held volumes of theology and classical learning in approximately equal measure with agricultural journals and local histories. "Reverend," Mr. Hale began after they had settled themselves with tea, "I hope you will not think me impertinent if I return to the subject we touched upon briefly after service last Sunday. I have learned something of the history involving Miss Wainwright and Mrs. Finch, and I confess myself puzzled by certain aspects of that history." The Reverend stirred his tea with careful attention, his expression troubled. "I counselled several parties during that period," he said slowly. "My predecessor, the Reverend Blackwood, had died the previous summer, and I was newly arrived to the parish. I was young then, Mr. Hale, and perhaps less certain in my judgments than I should have been." "What was the nature of your counsel, if I may ask?" The Reverend rose and moved to the window, looking out upon the darkening street. "I counselled forgiveness, Mr. Hale, and discretion. There were those who believed certain actions required public accounting. I encouraged them to consider mercy, to recognise that circumstances may be more complex than they appear, and that silence is sometimes the greater wisdom." He turned back toward his guest. "I believed then, and I believe now, that I acted rightly. Yet I confess that I did not, perhaps, understand fully what I was counselling others to accept. The child who was at the centre of those events, whether truly a foundling or something else, was removed from Hallowmere with such speed that few even saw the infant. Miss Wainwright died, and with her died certain knowledge that might have clarified much. And Eleanor Ashford?" "Departed without explanation. I spoke with her only once shortly before she left. She thanked me for my kindness and assured me that she had acted according to her conscience. There was a sorrow about her, Mr. Hale, but also a resolution. She gave me to understand that she had made choices which cost her dearly, but which she believed to be necessary." The Reverend returned to his chair, his hands clasped before him. "I have often wondered, over the years, whether the discretion I encouraged served truth or merely convenience, whether what we chose to forget was properly forgotten or improperly buried." Mr. Hale sat in thoughtful silence. The pieces of the puzzle were accumulating, yet they formed no clear picture. A child removed, a benefactor dead, a companion departed, and now, after more than 2 decades, a letter from the same London solicitor who had handled the original estate. Whatever had occurred in that winter of 1850 remained shrouded in uncertainty, but it was becoming clear that the letter Mrs. Finch had received on Christmas morning had awakened questions which discretion had long suppressed but never truly answered. "I thank you for your candour, Reverend," Mr. Hale said at length. "I believe Mrs. Finch to be a woman of integrity, and I am inclined to think that whatever the truth may be, it will prove less scandalous than speculation suggests." "I pray you are right," the Reverend replied. "For if there was injustice done, whether to Mrs. Finch or by her, it would grieve me greatly. She has been a blessing to this parish, and I would not see her peace disturbed without cause." As Mr. Hale walked homeward through the winter darkness, he reflected that mysteries are often less about discovering what happened than about understanding why it happened, and that the latter question requires not merely facts but compassion. Chapter 5: The Weight of Old Kindnesses. The peculiar characteristic of small towns, which distinguishes them from the more anonymous congregations of humanity found in great cities, is that every action, however private in intention, ripples outward through a web of connection and memory until it touches shores far distant from its origin. In Hallowmere, where 3 generations might reside within sight of one another, and where the butcher's daughter had married the draper's son in a union celebrated as the natural confluence of complementary trades, nothing occurred in isolation. Every history was entangled with every other, and the past exerted its influence upon the present with the quiet persistence of roots beneath paving stones. As Mr. Hale continued his inquiries, conducting them with that mixture of genuine interest and careful discretion which characterized his approach to all matters of human complexity, he discovered that the winter of 1850 had left its mark upon more souls than he had initially supposed. The death of Miss Wainwright and the departure of Eleanor Ashford had not been isolated events, but rather stones dropped into still water, their effects spreading outward in ways both visible and concealed. His attention was drawn, through a conversation overheard in the lending library, to the person of Mr. Leonard Griggs, a gentleman now approaching his 70th year, who had served as executor to Miss Wainwright's estate. Mr. Griggs maintained a small office above the draper's shop, where he conducted such legal and financial business as a country town required. He was known as a man of precision and probity, qualities which had earned him the trust of Hallowmere's more substantial citizens over the course of a long career. Mr. Hale called upon him on the pretext of requiring advice regarding certain documents related to his own modest property holdings. Mr. Griggs received him in an office whose shelves groaned beneath the weight of deed boxes and ledgers, each labelled with meticulous care and arranged according to some system comprehensible only to their keeper. After the necessary business had been concluded, Mr. Hale ventured to mention that he had been researching the town's history and had encountered references to the Wainwright estate. The effect upon Mr. Griggs was immediate and marked. His expression, previously one of professional courtesy, became guarded. He adjusted the spectacles upon his nose, a gesture which seemed less necessary than defensive. "The Wainwright matter," he said slowly, "was concluded more than 20 years ago, Mr. Hale. I handled it according to the strictest legal requirements." "I do not doubt it," Mr. Hale assured him. "I am curious only in the manner of one attempting to understand the town's past. I understand the estate passed to distant relations." To second cousins residing in Hampshire, Mr. Griggs confirmed. The Wainwright family had dwindled to a mere handful by that time. Miss Wainwright herself was the last of the direct line. The property and investments, after proper legal procedures, passed to those next entitled by blood. "And the household staff? I understand there were several servants." Mr. Griggs rose and moved to the window, his back to his visitor. "They were provided for according to their stations. The companion, Miss Ashford, received a sum appropriate to her years of service. The others likewise. All was done properly, Mr. Hale, I assure you." Yet there was something in his tone, a quality of insistence that seemed to protest more than the question warranted. Mr. Hale, sensitive to such nuances, recognised the voice of a man who had long justified his actions to himself, and perhaps did not find the justification as complete as he wished. "I have heard," Mr. Hale said gently, "that there were questions at the time, matters concerning a child." Mr. Griggs turned sharply. "There were rumours. There are always rumours when a wealthy woman dies and leaves her fortune to relations she scarcely knew. But rumours are not facts, Mr. Hale. I acted upon facts, upon legal documents properly witnessed and executed. What gossips chose to whisper in corners was no concern of mine." "Of course," Mr. Hale agreed. "Though I wonder if you might recall what became of the child, if child there was." "I was not privy to all domestic arrangements," Mr. Griggs replied stiffly. "My concern was the estate, not the household's private affairs. If Miss Wainwright had taken in a foundling, as some claimed, that child would have had no claim upon the estate in any case. The law is quite clear on such matters." Mr. Hale thanked him and departed, carrying with him the impression of a man who had acted within the letter of the law, while perhaps harbouring doubts about its spirit. It was not evidence of wrongdoing, but it suggested that the neat legal conclusion of Miss Wainwright's estate had left certain human questions unresolved. His next encounter proved more illuminating. Miss Ruth Calder, now a woman of advanced years, resided in a small cottage maintained largely through the charity of the parish. She had served as housemaid at Wainwright House during the final years of Miss Wainwright's life, and though her memory had grown uncertain in some particulars, she retained vivid recollections of that household. Mr. Hale found her in her cottage garden, despite the January cold, tending to rose bushes which would not bloom for many months yet. She greeted him with the cheerful vagueness of the elderly and seemed pleased to have company. After suitable preliminaries, Mr. Hale mentioned that he had been learning about the old days at Wainwright House. "Ah," said Miss Calder, her face softening with remembrance. "Those were good years, before the sadness came. Miss Wainwright was a fine lady, though lonely, I think. The house was too large for one person, even with servants. She read a great deal and kept to herself mostly. I understand Miss Ashford was a great comfort to her." "Oh, Eleanor," Miss Calder said warmly. "Such a sweet-natured girl and devoted to the mistress. When the baby came, it was Eleanor who cared for it night and day." "The baby was Miss Wainwright's, then?" Miss Calder looked confused. "I never rightly knew whose baby it was, sir. It appeared one autumn night, and the household was told to speak nothing of it. But I heard the mistress weeping sometimes, and I heard her say to Eleanor, 'You have given up everything.' Those were her very words, sir. 'You have given up everything, and I can never repay such sacrifice.'" "What happened to the child?" "It was taken away, sir, some months before the mistress died. Eleanor accompanied it, and when she returned her eyes were red from weeping. Shortly after that Miss Wainwright fell ill. Some said it was grief that killed her, though the doctor said it was pneumonia." Miss Calder plucked absently at a bare rose stem. "Eleanor left soon after the funeral. She gave me this cottage, sir, though I never understood how she had the means. Said it was a gift from Miss Wainwright's estate, but Mr. Griggs claimed to know nothing of it. I have lived here ever since, and every winter I remember that sad household, and wonder what became of that poor baby." As Mr. Hale walked back toward the town centre, the story had begun to acquire a shape, though its true outline remained obscured by conflicting accounts and deliberate silences. What was becoming clear was that Eleanor Ashford had been at the centre of events, trusted by Miss Wainwright, suspected by some, and remembered by others with affection. Whether she had been beneficiary or victim, manipulator or sacrifice, remained to be determined. But the weight of old kindnesses, both given and received, pressed upon the present with increasing force, and Mr. Hale understood that the truth, when it emerged, would likely prove more complex and more painful than simple scandal. Chapter 6. What was remembered incorrectly. Memory, that treacherous faculty upon which we nonetheless depend for our very sense of continuity and self, possesses the unfortunate tendency to reshape the past according to the demands of the present. What we remember is rarely what occurred, but rather what we needed to have occurred in order to justify what we have since become. In this manner, communities no less than individuals construct histories which serve comfort more faithfully than they serve truth. Mr. Jonathan Hale, having accumulated a considerable body of recollections from various sources, found himself in possession of what appeared to be several different stories wearing the same names and dates. The contradictions were not dramatic, consisting rather of those small discrepancies which might be attributed to the ordinary failures of memory. Yet, as he sat in his study one evening, arranging his notes with the methodical care of a scholar attempting to construct a coherent narrative from fragmentary sources, he began to perceive that certain inconsistencies pointed toward a conclusion quite different from what the town's collective memory had established. The dates, for instance, troubled him. Mrs. Lowen had placed Miss Wainwright's death on the 14th of February, 1851. The Reverend Crowley, consulting such parish records as survived, confirmed this. Yet Miss Calder had spoken of the child being removed some months before the death, which would place its departure in the autumn of 1850. Mrs. Lowen, however, had suggested that the child's disappearance had coincided with Eleanor Ashford's departure after the funeral, which occurred in late February. These were not contradictions that suggested deliberate deception, but rather the natural blurring that occurs when events are recalled across the gulf of years. Yet they mattered, for they altered the sequence and therefore the meaning of what had transpired. Mr. Hale determined to consult the one source which, unlike human memory, did not reshape itself to suit present convenience: the written record. The parish registers, maintained with varying degrees of accuracy over the decades, resided in a locked cabinet in the vestry of St. Edmund's. The Reverend Crowley, when approached with a request to examine them, proved somewhat reluctant. "I am uncertain what you hope to discover, Mr. Hale," he said, though he made no absolute refusal. "The past, once properly interred, is perhaps best left undisturbed." "I seek only accuracy, Reverend," Mr. Hale replied. "If Mrs. Finch is to be judged, whether favourably or otherwise, Let it be upon what actually occurred rather than what has been imperfectly remembered. The Reverend, recognising the justice of this position, consented. Together they examined the registers for the years 1848 through 1852, those volumes being most relevant to the matter at hand. What they discovered proved illuminating. Miss Arabella Wainwright's death was recorded on the 14th of February 1851, as reported. But there was another entry, easily overlooked, dated the 10th of October 1850. It recorded a baptism performed privately at Wainwright House, a female child, name given as Sarah, parents listed simply as of the household. No surname was recorded, and the entry bore the notation foundling in the margin. "I had forgotten this," the Reverend murmured. "Or rather, my predecessor performed the baptism, and I inherited the record without the story attached to it." Mr. Hale's attention had been caught by another detail. The baptism had occurred in October of 1850, yet Miss Calder had spoken of the child arriving one autumn night. If the baptism followed soon after arrival, then the child had been in the household for several months before Miss Wainwright's death, not merely a few weeks as some accounts suggested. Further examination revealed another significant entry, a record of charitable donations made to the parish, dated November 1850 through January 1851. The donations were listed as coming from E. Ashford in trust, and were of a modest but consistent amount. The notation was in the Reverend Blackwood's hand, and beside it he had written a single word: education. Eleanor Ashford was supporting someone's education, Mr. Hale said slowly, even then, even while still in service. The Reverend nodded. It would seem so, though whose education and how a companion of limited means came to have funds in trust I cannot say. And armed with these discoveries, Mr. Hale next turned his attention to a matter which had troubled him since his conversation with Mr. Griggs. The executor had claimed that the estate passed to distant cousins in Hampshire according to proper legal procedure. Yet Mrs. Lowen had suggested that the disposition had been hasty, and Miss Calder had mentioned a cottage given to her by Eleanor, though Mr. Griggs denied knowledge of it. Mr. Hale composed a carefully worded letter to the Somerset House Registry, inquiring after property transfers in Hallowmere during the year 1851. The reply, when it arrived some weeks later, contained information which cast the accepted narrative in a decidedly different light. The cottage in which Miss Calder resided had indeed been transferred to her, but not as a gift from the Wainwright estate. The transfer had been made in November of 1850, 3 months before Miss Wainwright's death, and the grantor was listed as Eleanor Ashford. The sum paid was nominal, suggesting a gift, yet the source of Eleanor's ability to make such a gift was nowhere indicated. More significantly, the registry revealed that a small property in Somerset, part of the original Wainwright holdings, had been placed in a complicated trust arrangement in December of 1850. The trust specified that income from the property was to be used for the education and maintenance of a child of the parish, with Eleanor Ashford named as trustee. Upon the child reaching majority, or upon the trustee's death, the property was to revert to the Wainwright estate for final disposition. This arrangement had evidently been made while Miss Wainwright still lived, yet it had not been mentioned in the settlement of her estate. Mr. Griggs had either been unaware of it, which seemed unlikely for a conscientious executor, or had chosen not to include it in his accounting, which suggested motivations less than transparent. The picture that emerged from these discoveries was neither simple nor scandalous, but rather poignant in its complexity. Eleanor Ashford had somehow come into possession of modest means while still in service. She had used those means to secure a home for an elderly servant and to establish a trust for the education of a child. She had done so before her employer's death, yet the estate settlement had proceeded as though these arrangements did not exist. The most troubling implication was that the inheritance which had recently been restored to Mrs. Finch might not be an unexpected windfall, but rather the return of something which had been, through legal manoeuvring or simple oversight, misdirected decades earlier. The Somerset property, held in trust for a child who had disappeared from Hallowmere's memory, had never been properly accounted for. Mr. Hale sat late into the evening contemplating these findings. The town had remembered a story of possible manipulation, of a companion who might have unduly influenced a vulnerable employer. But the document suggested a different narrative entirely, one in which Eleanor Ashford had possessed resources she should not have had, yet had used them not for personal enrichment, but for the benefit of others. The mystery was no longer whether she had benefited unjustly, but how she'd come to have anything to give in the first place, and why the giving of it had been so carefully concealed. The truth, Mr. Hale reflected, was revealing itself not as a dramatic revelation, but as a slow correction of accumulated misunderstanding. What the town had remembered incorrectly was not the facts themselves, but their arrangement and significance. The question now was whether anyone, including Mrs. Finch herself, possessed knowledge of what had truly transpired in those long-ago months when a child arrived, a benefactor weakened, and a young woman made choices whose consequences were still unfolding nearly a quarter-century later. Chapter 7. Winters long before this one. There are stories which, though they concern events of great consequence to those who lived them, pass into obscurity not through lack of witnesses, but through an excess of discretion. Such stories become like rivers that flow underground, their courses known only by the occasional spring that breaks the surface, hinting at depths and currents unseen. The true history of Eleanor Ashford and Miss Arabella Wainwright was such a story, and it required more than mere documents to bring it fully into the light. Mr. Hale's researches had revealed the skeleton of events, but skeletons, however carefully assembled, cannot speak. What was needed was the voice of someone who had known the principals intimately, who had witnessed the unfolding of that long-ago winter with understanding rather than mere observation. Such a person, Mr. Hale had come to believe, might yet exist, though finding them would require both persistence and fortune. Fortune, as it happened, arrived in the form of a letter forwarded to him by Miss Thornbury of the Lending Library. It came from a Mrs. Harriet Pemberton of Bath, a distant relation of the late Miss Wainwright, who had seen Mr. Hale's name mentioned in correspondence with the Somerset Registry, and had taken it upon herself to write to him, care of the library, that being the only Hallowmere address she could recall. The letter, written in a clear if somewhat tremulous hand, expressed Mrs. Pemberton's understanding that inquiries were being made regarding her late cousin's affairs. She wished to know, she wrote, whether these inquiries were prompted by malice or by a genuine desire for understanding, for she possessed information which she had long kept in confidence, but which, given recent developments, she felt ought perhaps to be made known to those who sought the truth in good faith. Mr. Hale replied immediately, assuring Mrs. Pemberton of his honourable intentions, and expressing his willingness to call upon her in Bath should she be amenable to such a visit. Her response came within the week, inviting him to take tea with her on a date convenient to his arrangements. Thus it was that on a grey February afternoon, Mr. Hale found himself in the drawing-room of a genteel establishment in Bath, seated across from a lady of perhaps 75 years, whose aristocratic bearing could not entirely conceal the warmth of her manner. "You must understand, Mr. Hale," Mrs. Pemberton began, after the tea had been poured and the initial courtesies observed, "that I have kept silent on these matters for more than 2 decades. I did so not from shame, but from respect for promises made and confidence given. My cousin Arabella was a woman of deep feeling and absolute integrity, and what she chose to keep private I felt obliged to honour. I am grateful for your willingness to speak now," Mr. Hale said gently. Mrs. Pemberton nodded. "I am old, Mr. Hale, and the obligations of the dead weigh less heavily upon me than they once did. Moreover, I understand that Eleanor has received notification regarding the Somerset property. If that is so, then certain truths can no longer be avoided, and it is better they be known truly than guessed at falsely." She set down her teacup and folded her hands in her lap, gathering her thoughts before continuing. Arabella was never to marry. This was not for want of offers in her youth, but because her affections had been engaged by a gentleman whose circumstances made marriage impossible. He was married already, you see, trapped in a union arranged by his family when he was scarcely more than a boy. He and Arabella met when she was 28, and they loved each other with a devotion that did them credit even as their situation did them none. Mrs. Pemberton paused, her expression softening with remembrance. It was an attachment conducted with absolute propriety, Mr. Hale. They met rarely, corresponded seldom, and maintained always the strictest boundaries of honour. When he died, some 15 years into their attachment, Arabella mourned him as a widow mourns, though she had no right to the title or the consolation of public grief. "And the child?" Mr. Hale prompted gently. "Was his, though not Arabella's," Mrs. Pemberton replied. His wife, a woman of unstable temperament, had borne him a daughter some months before his death. When he died, suddenly and without provision for this child, the mother rejected the infant entirely, declared it a curse and would not suffer it in her presence, The gentleman's family, concerned more with avoiding scandal than with the child's welfare, sought to place it in an institution. Mrs. Pemberton's voice grew firmer. Arabella could not bear this. The child was all that remained of the man she had loved. She determined to take the infant and raise it as a foundling she had charitably adopted. But here she encountered a difficulty. A woman of her years and station, unmarried and living alone, could not simply acquire a child without provoking speculation of the most damaging kind. And so she required assistance, Mr. Hale said, understanding beginning to dawn. Just so, Eleanor Ashford had come into Arabella's service the previous year. She was a young woman of good character but unfortunate circumstances, an orphan with no family and few prospects. Arabella confided in her the truth of the situation and made her an extraordinary proposal. Mrs. Pemberton leaned forward slightly. She offered Eleanor a sum sufficient to establish her independence, in exchange for Eleanor accepting public responsibility for the child. Eleanor would claim to have borne a child out of wedlock, would endure the shame and censure such an admission would bring, and would then relinquish the child to Arabella's care, ostensibly as a foundling being charitably adopted. In this way, the child would be saved, Arabella would have the comfort of raising her beloved's daughter, and Eleanor would eventually have the means to begin life anew once the scandal had faded and she could remove herself to a place where she was unknown. Mr. Hale sat in silence, the full weight of this revelation settling upon him. Eleanor Ashford had not manipulated a vulnerable employer. She had sacrificed her own reputation, her place in society, her prospects for marriage and respect in order to save a child she had no natural obligation to protect. The child was taken away, Mrs. Pemberton continued, because Arabella fell ill more swiftly than anyone had anticipated. She realized she would not live to raise the daughter as she had planned. In her final months she arranged for the child to be sent to a respectable family in the north of England, people of means who could provide what Arabella no longer could. She established the trust to ensure the child's education, and she instructed that upon her death, Eleanor was to receive the Somerset property as recompense for the sacrifice she had made. But the property was not given to her, Mr. Hale said. No, Mrs. Pemberton confirmed, her expression growing stern. Arabella's will was clear, but it was also complex, and there were those among the executors who felt that Eleanor had been adequately compensated for her services. The Somerset property became entangled in legal disputes. Eleanor, wishing only to escape the painful memories of Hallowmere, did not fight for it. She took what modest sum was offered and departed, believing the matter closed. Mrs. Pemberton poured more tea, her movements deliberate. But the law, Mr. Hale grind slowly and exceeding fine. The disputes were eventually resolved, and the courts determined that Arabella's intentions had been improperly executed. The property, with accumulated rents dating back to her death, has been deemed to belong rightfully to Eleanor Finch. It is a matter of justice long delayed, not of fortune undeserved. As Mr. Hale travelled back to Hallowmere that evening, he carried with him the true story of that long-ago winter, and with it the understanding that Eleanor Ashford had given up not merely everything, as Miss Wainwright had said, but her very honour itself for the sake of a child who was not her own. Chapter 8. The Shape of a Forgotten Mercy. Truth, when it emerges after long concealment, does not always arrive with the force of revelation. Sometimes it comes quietly, settling upon the understanding like snow upon a landscape, transforming what had seemed familiar into something altogether different, yet doing so with such gentleness that one scarcely notices the moment of change itself. So it was that Mr. Jonathan Hale, returning from Bath with the full knowledge of Eleanor Ashford's sacrifice, found himself seeing Hallowmere with altered eyes. The town which had seemed merely curious about Mrs. Finch's unexpected inheritance now appeared to him as a community unconsciously nursing old guilts and half-remembered shames. For if Eleanor had been wronged, then those who had whispered about her, who had allowed her to depart under clouds of undeserved suspicion, who had settled comfortably into the silence that followed her leaving, bore some portion of responsibility for that wrong. Yet Mr. Hale was not a man inclined toward accusation. He understood that ignorance is not the same as malice, and that a community which errs collectively may yet redeem itself collectively, given opportunity and proper understanding. The question which occupied his thoughts was not how to apportion blame, but how to restore what had been lost without inflicting unnecessary pain in the process. He began with a visit to Mrs. Finch herself. It was a delicate matter, for he could not be certain how much she wished her history to be known, nor whether the reopening of such painful memories would be welcome or cruel. Yet he felt that she deserved to know that someone understood the truth of what she'd endured, and that the town's current speculations, however uncomfortable, might be gently corrected before they hardened into new injustices. He found her at home on an afternoon when weak February sunlight struggled through persistent clouds. She received him in her modest parlour, that same room where the Christmas letter had first been opened, and offered him tea with the calm hospitality that characterised all her actions. "Mr. Hale," she said, when they were settled, "I suspect your visit is not merely social." "No, Mrs. Finch," he admitted. "I have been making inquiries into certain historical matters, and I have learned things which I believe you should know have come to light." She set down her teacup with steady hands. "You have discovered the truth about the child." "I have," he confirmed gently. "Mrs. Pemberton of Bath was kind enough to share with me what she knew of your arrangement with Miss Wainwright." Mrs. Finch was silent for a moment, her gaze directed toward the window. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "I have never regretted what I did, Mr. Hale. The cost was high, higher perhaps than I fully understood when I agreed to it. But Sarah was innocent, and she deserved a chance at life unburdened by the circumstances of her birth. That Miss Wainwright could not, in the end, provide that life herself was tragedy enough. That I could help, even at the price of my own reputation, seemed the very least I could do. The child thrived, I hope." A soft smile touched Mrs. Finch's features, the first genuine expression of happiness Mr. Hale had seen her display. "She did indeed. The family who took her in were good people, prosperous merchants in York. They raised her as their own daughter, and never told her the truth of her origins. She married well, and has children of her own now. I have followed her life from a distance, never intruding, but always knowing that she was safe and loved. And the payments you made for education were for the children of servants from Wainwright House who found themselves in difficult circumstances after Miss Wainwright's death," Mrs. Finch replied. "I had received a small sum when I left, and I felt it should be used for those who had even less than I. Miss Calder's cottage was similarly placed, for she had nowhere else to go, and I could not bear to see her turned out." Mr. Hale leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Finch, the inheritance that has been restored to you was meant to be yours from the beginning. Miss Wainwright intended it as recompense for your sacrifice. You were denied what was rightfully yours through legal manoeuvring or oversight." "I know," she said simply. The letter from Messrs. Caldwell explained as much. The firm's founder, old Mr. Caldwell, handled the estate improperly. His son, discovering the error in reviewing old files, felt obligated to correct it. I did not seek this restoration, but neither can I in conscience refuse it. The money represents Miss Wainwright's wishes, and I will honour those wishes as I have always tried to do." "The town," Mr. Hale ventured carefully, "has been speculating about your circumstances. There are those who wonder whether you came by this inheritance fairly." Mrs. Finch's expression remained composed. "I expected as much. Memory is selective, Mr. Hale, and people recall what they need to recall in order to maintain their peace of mind. I left Hallowmere under a shadow of my own making, and I returned as Mrs. Finch, widow of a respectable clerk, hoping that the past would remain buried. Perhaps that was foolish of me." "It was understandable," Mr. Hale said warmly. "But I wonder, with your permission, whether the truth might now be shared. Not to shame those who thought ill of you, but to restore your honour and to allow the community to make amends for assumptions that were uncharitable if understandable." Mrs. Finch considered this proposal in silence. Outside, the weak sun had lost its brief battle with the clouds, and a light rain began to fall, pattering against the window glass with patient persistence. "I am weary of silence, Mr. Hale," she said at last. "I have lived with it for so long that it has become almost comfortable, like an old garment worn thin but familiar. Yet you are right that silence has allowed misunderstanding to flourish. If the truth can be told without vindictiveness, without causing unnecessary pain to those who merely failed to understand, then perhaps it should be told." "There is another consideration," Mr. Hale added gently. "Sarah herself. She is a woman grown, with children of her own. Does she deserve to know that her life was purchased at such cost, that somewhere in England an elderly woman has carried the burden of her secret all these years?" Mrs. Finch's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "I have thought of that often. Miss Wainwright wished her to live unburdened by knowledge of her origins, yet she is no longer a child who needs protecting. She's a woman who might wish to know that she was loved enough that strangers sacrifice for her sake. She rose and moved to her writing desk, withdrawing from it a worn leather portfolio. I have kept records, Mr. Hale. Letters from the family in York reporting on her progress. Clippings from the York newspapers mentioning her husband's business successes. A notice of her eldest son's admission to Cambridge. All the pieces of a life lived well. A life that justified everything that was given up to make it possible. Mr. Hale accepted the portfolio, understanding the trust being placed in him. I will use this information wisely, Mrs. Finch, I promise you that. As he departed her cottage that evening, the rain having settled into a steady drizzle, Mr. Hale reflected that mercy, once given, continues to ripple outward through time in ways both seen and unseen. Eleanor Ashford had shown mercy to a helpless child. Now perhaps Hallowmere could show mercy to Eleanor by finally understanding the shape of the sacrifice she had made and the grace with which she had borne its consequences. Chapter 9. A Truth Spoken Softly. There are occasions when the telling of truth requires neither proclamation nor drama, but rather the quiet assembly of those who most need to hear it, and the careful presentation of facts in a manner that allows understanding to dawn naturally, without the harsh glare of accusation or the sting of shame. Mr. Jonathan Hale, understanding this principle well, gave considerable thought to how the history of Mrs. Finch might best be shared with those members of the community whose opinions carried weight, and whose comprehension would influence the broader sentiment of the town. He determined that a small gathering at the rectory, ostensibly for the discussion of parish matters, but in truth for a purpose more specific, would serve his intentions admirably. The Reverend Crowley, when approached with this suggestion, proved immediately amenable, for he had been growing increasingly troubled by the whispers that circulated regarding Mrs. Finch, and welcomed any opportunity to replace speculation with fact. Thus, on an evening in late February when the days had begun to lengthen imperceptibly, and the first brave snowdrops had appeared in sheltered gardens, a small company assembled in the rectory's drawing-room. Present were the Reverend himself, Mrs. Lowen, Mr. Griggs the executor, and at Mr. Hale's particular request Mrs. Finch, who had agreed to attend though she knew not precisely what was to be discussed. The room was warmed by a good fire, and tea had been provided with that attention to comfort which makes difficult conversations more bearable. When all was settled, Mr. Hale rose, holding in his hands the leather portfolio Mrs. Finch had entrusted to him. "My friends," he began, his tone conversational rather than formal, "I have asked you here this evening because a matter of some importance to our community requires clarification. You're all aware that Mrs. Finch received on Christmas morning a communication from a London solicitor regarding an inheritance. This event has occasioned considerable interest, and I regret to say some speculation of an uncharitable nature." Mrs. Lowen shifted in her seat, though whether from discomfort or curiosity was unclear. Mr. Griggs maintained the carefully neutral expression of one who has learned through professional necessity to reveal nothing of his thoughts. "I have undertaken," Mr. Hale continued, "to discover the facts of the matter, not from any desire to pry into Mrs. Finch's private affairs, but because I believed that truth, once known, would serve everyone better than rumour. What I have learned is a history of such quiet nobility that I confess myself moved by it, and I hope that when you have heard it, you will be moved likewise." He proceeded then to relate, with eloquence born of deep feeling and careful preparation, the story as he had pieced it together from documents and testimony. He spoke of Miss Arabella Wainwright's impossible love and her determination to save the child of the man she had cherished. He described the proposal made to young Eleanor Ashford and the extraordinary sacrifice she had accepted. "She claimed the child as her own illegitimate offspring," Mr. Hale explained, his voice gentle but clear, knowing full well what such a claim would cost her in reputation and prospects. She endured the whispers and the censure, she bore the weight of a shame that was not hers, in order that an innocent child might have the chance at a respectable life. Mrs. Finch sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed but her eyes reflecting the pain of memories long carried in silence. "The child," Mr. Hale continued, "was sent to a good family in Yorkshire after Miss Wainwright's health failed. She has lived a life of happiness and prosperity, never knowing the sacrifice made on her behalf. Eleanor Ashford received a small sum for her service, and was promised the Somerset property as fuller recompense. That property, through legal oversight or deliberate misdirection, was not given to her. She departed Hallowmere rather than fight for what was rightfully hers, seeking only to escape painful associations and begin anew. He turned to Mr. Griggs, his gaze direct but not unkind. The recent communication from Messrs. Caldwell and Sons represents the correction of that long-ago error. The current Mr. Caldwell, reviewing his father's files, discovered the discrepancy and felt honour-bound to rectify it. The inheritance is not a windfall, but rather justice delayed by more than 20 years. The room was profoundly quiet. Mrs. Lowen had pressed a handkerchief to her lips, her eyes wide with the shock of understanding. Mr. Griggs had gone quite pale, his professional composure shaken by the realization of the role he had unwittingly played in perpetuating an injustice. The Reverend Crowley was the first to speak. "Mrs. Finch," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I find myself overwhelmed with admiration for what you did, and with regret for what you were forced to endure. That this community allowed you to bear such a burden alone, that we permitted assumptions of impropriety to stand unchallenged, shames us all." Mrs. Lowen rose and crossed to where Mrs. Finch sat. "My dear Eleanor," she said, and there were tears upon her cheeks, "I am among the guilty. I harboured suspicions, I repeated whispers, and I never once considered that there might be a story of grace beneath the scandal I imagined. Can you forgive such blindness?" Mrs. Finch took Mrs. Lowen's extended hands in her own. "There is nothing to forgive," she said softly. "You knew only what you could see, and I chose to allow you to see what would protect another. The fault, if fault there was, lies not in your failing to understand, but in circumstances that required such deception in the first place." Mr. Griggs, who had been sitting in stricken silence, finally found his voice. "I executed that estate according to the letter of the law," he said, though his tone carried no defensiveness, only regret. "But I fear I did not execute it according to the spirit of justice. I wonder now whether I was too hasty, too willing to satisfy distant heirs, and too little concerned with those who had served faithfully." "You acted according to your understanding at the time," Mrs. Finch replied with characteristic generosity. "That fuller understanding has now come is perhaps evidence that truth, however long delayed, finds its way to light eventually." The Reverend rose and moved to stand beside the fire, his hands clasped behind his back. "What troubles me most," he said thoughtfully, "is that a young woman felt compelled to destroy her own good name in order to preserve a child's future. That our society creates conditions in which such choices become necessary speaks to failings far beyond this single case. We pride ourselves on our Christian charity, yet we maintain structures of judgment that punish the innocent along with the guilty, and sometimes punish innocence most severely of all." Mr. Hale nodded. "Which is why, Reverend, I believe this story should be more widely known, not to condemn Hallowmere for its past ignorance, but to remind us all that the quick assumption of wrongdoing serves neither truth nor mercy. Mrs. Finch's sacrifice was made in silence, but perhaps its revelation can teach us to be slower to condemn and quicker to consider that what appears as scandal may in truth be courage." The gathering continued for some time, moving from revelation to reflection, from individual guilt to collective understanding. There were apologies offered and graciously accepted, there were tears shed and comfort given, and through it all ran the quiet recognition that a wrong, though long-standing, could yet be acknowledged, and a measure of justice, though delayed, could yet be done. When at last the company dispersed into the February night, each carried with them not merely the facts of an old story, but a renewed appreciation for the complexity of human choice and the danger of hasty judgment. Truth had been spoken softly, but it had been heard clearly, and in the hearing, Hallowmere had taken its first steps toward a more complete and compassionate understanding of one who had dwelt among them with unrecognized nobility for many years. Chapter 10. Christmas. Restored in quiet measure. Spring came to Hallowmere that year with a gentleness that seemed almost apologetic, as though nature herself wished to soothe the small wounds of revelation and misunderstanding that the winter had uncovered. The snowdrops gave way to crocuses, and the crocuses in turn to daffodils, each succession of bloom marking the passage of time and the gradual healing that time, when accompanied by goodwill, invariably brings. The truth of Mrs. Finch's history, once shared with that small gathering at the rectory, had spread through the town with the same inevitability as the spring flowers, yet with considerably more care than such news usually receives. Mrs. Lowen, to her great credit, had taken it upon herself to ensure that the story was told accurately and with proper emphasis upon its lesson of charity, rather than its potential for sensation. She, who had once been most ready to suspect, now became most vigorous in defence, and there was something touching in the thoroughness of her conversion. The inheritance, when it was formally settled, proved to be substantial though not extravagant. Mrs. Finch found herself possessed of the Somerset property, a modest but well-maintained estate that generated sufficient rents to provide comfort, together with accumulated revenues that represented more than 2 decades of careful stewardship by the courts. It was, as Mr. Hale had said, justice delayed, and Mrs. Finch received it with the same quiet dignity with which she had borne its denial. What she chose to do with this restoration of her rightful property was observed by Hallowmere with interest that gradually transformed into admiration. She did not remove to Somerset, nor did she alter her habits of modest living. Instead, she set about a series of benefactions that spoke eloquently of her character and her understanding of what Miss Wainwright would have wished. The first of these was the establishment of a small school attached to St. Edmund's parish, for the education of children whose families could not afford the usual fees. It was not a grand institution, but rather a simple room fitted with desks and books, presided over by Miss Thornbury of the Lending Library, who had long harboured ambitions toward teaching but had lacked the means to pursue them. The school opened on the 1st of May, and 12 children attended that first day, their faces bright with the peculiar excitement of opportunity newly offered. The church roof, which had been in increasingly parlous condition for several years, was repaired with materials of excellent quality and workmanship that would endure for generations. The Reverend Crowley, when he thanked Mrs. Finch for this generosity, found himself quite overcome, and it was several moments before he could speak coherently. When he did, he assured her that her kindness would be remembered in the prayers of the congregation for as long as St. Edmund's stood to shelter them. There was also a cottage on the outskirts of the town that had long stood empty and neglected. Mrs. Finch purchased it, restored it to comfortable habitability, and made it available at modest rent to families in temporary need of housing. The first occupants were a young couple whose own cottage had been destroyed by fire, and who had been living with relations in circumstances of some crowding and considerable strain. Their gratitude, expressed with the fervour of those who have experienced genuine need, moved Mrs. Finch to tears, though she quickly composed herself and insisted that she had merely done what anyone in her position ought to do. Yet perhaps the most significant of her acts, though it was conducted with such discretion that few knew of it, concerned Sarah herself. Mrs. Finch, after much deliberation, and with Mr. Hale's counsel, had written to the woman whose life she had helped to save so many years before. The letter explained, with gentle care, the circumstances of Sarah's birth and the sacrifices made on her behalf. It asked nothing, demanded nothing, but merely offered the truth in case truth was desired. Sarah's reply came in June, and it was a document that Mrs. Finch would treasure for the remainder of her days. Sarah expressed astonishment, gratitude, and a deep desire to meet the woman who had given up so much for a stranger's child. She wrote of her happy life, her loving family, and her wonder at discovering that she had been the object of such selfless care. She concluded by asking if Mrs. Finch would consent to visit her in York, that she might express her thanks in person and introduce Mrs. Finch to the grandchildren whose very existence was owed to courage she had never known about. The meeting, when it occurred in July, was by all accounts profoundly moving. Sarah, a handsome woman of middle years with her father's gentle eyes and her mother's determined chin, embraced Mrs. Finch with unaffected warmth. They spent several days together, Sarah listening with rapt attention to stories of Miss Wainwright and the love that had motivated such extraordinary measures. When Mrs. Finch returned to Hallowmere, she carried with her not only Sarah's gratitude but the satisfaction of knowing that the sacrifice made so long ago had borne fruit more abundant than anyone could have anticipated. As summer deepened and the anniversary of that fateful Christmas morning approached once more, Mr. Hale had occasion to reflect upon all that had transpired. He sat in his study one evening, updating his journals with a conclusion of the history he had so carefully documented, and found himself considering the peculiar nature of memory and the manner in which communities remember or forget according to their comfort. Hallowmere had remembered, imperfectly and incompletely, a winter of scandal and mystery. What it had forgotten, or never properly known, was the grace that lay beneath the surface of events. Now, with truth restored, the town possessed a memory more complete, and considerably more edifying. Mrs. Finch was no longer merely the quiet widow who organised church fêtes and visited the sick. She was a woman who had sacrificed honour itself for the sake of an innocent child, who had borne judgment in silence rather than expose others to pain, and who had returned good for the evil of misunderstanding. The transformation in how she was regarded was subtle, but profound. Greetings in the street carried new warmth. Invitations to tea were extended with genuine pleasure rather than mere politeness, and when she entered church on Sunday mornings, there was a perceptible sense of respect that went beyond ordinary courtesy. She had become, though she would have rejected such description, something approaching a moral exemplar for the community. Yet Mrs. Finch herself remained unchanged in her essential character. She continued her charitable works, attended to her modest household, and conducted herself with the same unassuming grace that had always characterized her manner. If she took satisfaction in the restoration of her good name, she gave no outward sign of it. She seemed concerned primarily with using her restored means wisely, and with ensuring that the memory of Miss Wainwright's love and sacrifice was honoured in practical ways. When Christmas came again to Hallowmere, arriving on schedule and with its usual mixture of frost and festivity, the town observed it with perhaps a deeper understanding of its true meaning. For Christmas, properly understood, commemorates not merely a birth but a sacrifice, not merely giving but giving up, not merely love professed but love enacted at terrible cost. The morning service at St. Edmund's was well attended, and the Reverend Crowley's sermon touched upon themes of mercy, sacrifice, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people who choose what is right over what is comfortable. He did not mention Mrs. Finch by name, but everyone present understood to whom he referred, and when the congregation rose to sing the final hymn, their voices carried a conviction born of recent instruction. As the worshippers dispersed into the cold December sunlight, Mrs. Finch walked homeward along familiar streets, exchanging greetings with neighbours who had become, through the alchemy of truth and time, true friends. The letter that had arrived exactly 1 year earlier had disturbed the peace of her retirement and awakened memories she had long kept carefully stored. Yet in disturbing that peace, it had also restored something more valuable, the recognition that she had lived according to conscience, that her sacrifice had not been in vain, and that mercy, though it may be forgotten for a season, endures beyond the failing of memory. Christmas had been restored to Hallowmere in quiet measure, not through any grand gesture but through the simple acknowledgement that love sometimes requires the giving up of everything, and that such giving, though it may pass unnoticed for years, ultimately transforms both giver and receiver in ways beyond reckoning. The town remembered now, remembered truly, and in that true remembrance found cause not for shame, but for humble gratitude that such nobility had dwelt among them, unrecognised but not unreal all along.